Several years ago, in connection with a project that we were doing here at Suffolk, I visited a nondescript building on Comac Road. The building, owned by Verizon, has on its ground floor something known as the Telephone Pioneers Museum. And it has a great collection of old telephones, and it even has part of its tour narrated by the legendary talking mannequin Suffolk Susie. I think we're on her photograph right now. There she is. But at that museum, I learned that, like many inventions, the telephone was not the work of one person. While Alexander Graham Bell was working on the telephone, he was in a race with several other inventors. His greatest achievement may have been beating some of the competition to patents, and above all else, achieving financial success with his invention. In the invention of wireless, a similar thing could be said about Guglielmo Marconi. He was, in fact, one of several people worldwide who were experimenting with the Hertzian wave. His family's wealth, however, gave him a huge advantage. When the Italian government would not patent his invention, his mother's connections were a big help. Quoting from Broadcasting in America by Sidney Head and Christopher Sterling, his mother came from the Jameson family, well-known British whiskey distillers. She arranged introductions to important English postal and military officials, the most likely customers in Britain for the invention. Marconi, by then 22 years old, went to London and registered his patent in 1896. He went on to establish the British Marconi Company in 1897 and the American Marconi Company in 1899. These companies, built for the transmission of Morse code for ships to the shore and ship to ship, went on to become a dominant force in early 20th century communications and made Marconi even wealthier. Canada's Reginald Fessenden is generally acknowledged to have performed the first experimental broadcasts of music and voice in 1906. Like many inventions, most notably Lee DeForest's, many other inventions, most notably Lee DeForest's Audion tube in 1906, set the table for what became the radio industry. And with the establishment of KDKA in 1920, a virtual explosion of radio stations was to follow. Almost lost in all of the technological innovations that led to radio is the Kentuckian Nathan B. Stubblefield. While it can be said that Marconi's success was as much a commercial success as a scientific one, Stubblefield was the opposite. Paranoia and a lack of business acumen were most likely the reasons he has been almost forgotten in history. In a paper presented at the 1961 convention of the Kentucky Broadcasters Association, James L. Johnson wrote, "He had an opportunity to gain vast wealth and worldwide recognition, but he died of starvation. He loved his family, but he lost them. He loved life, but he selfishly destroyed it. His mind was one of the world's greatest, and it destroyed him." I first heard of Stubblefield from one of my professors in graduate school. He said that some people felt he invented radio before Marconi, and that this had been written about in a few places, he said. Well, indeed, I did find a few references. One text that has mentioned Stubblefield is Stay Tuned by Christopher Sterling and John Kittros. They credit him with having demonstrated ground conduction voice signals over several hundred yards in 1892. Keep in mind, that was 14 years before Fessenden has been acknowledged to be the first to transmit voice. When I began teaching at Suffolk, I think you should see a photo of that. That's ancient history. But when I began teaching at Suffolk, in Intro to Broadcasting, I would give out a suggested term papers topic list, and at the bottom of the list was always the true story of Nathan B. Stubblefield. I would tell students they would be dealing with a nearly impossible research task if they did this paper, as very little was written on Stubblefield. In 1977, one student took up the challenge. He was a fellow in his mid-30s by the name of George Arnold, who was a top official in the bus drivers union in Nassau County. On his vacation, he and his girlfriend went down to Murray, Kentucky, to find out all that they could about Stubblefield. He came back with a virtual gold mine of research, and he got an A on his paper. Throughout this presentation, I'll quote from this paper, make references to things from his paper, and show some photos that he provided from his visit. He actually, if I can digress from my script for a moment, went down there. He found a retired professor from Murray State University who actually knew Rainey T. Wells, who in the 1880s was the first person ever to hear a Stubblefield voice transmission. The first words were, "Hello, Rainey, hello, Rainey." And this gentleman knew Rainey Wells, and he had gathered in a trunk in a basement of a building at Murray State all of Stubblefield's inventions. And they took them out of the trunk, and we have photographs of them, as you'll see. In the late 1800s, Stubblefield was clearly focused on the research of Tesla and Hertz, but he needed money for his research. According to James Johnson's paper, realizing that none of Graham Bell's telephones had yet reached his community, he set out to invent a phone to sell. The result was a device he called a vibrating telephone. As Johnson points out, Stubblefield had built a telephone that worked without wires. This was the first radio in existence, but he did not realize or grasp the significance of his achievement. At the time, Marconi was 10 years old and still in Italy. These phones worked quite well. In an article about Stubblefield for the website Borderland Sciences, Jerry Vassilatos writes, "There was simply no precedent for this development. Common people could now have the much-needed communications which both great distance and poverty prohibited. Farms could be interlinked by the Stubblefield exchange simply by plugging terminals into the ground. Wire would not take up the expense which the telephone exchange would later charge to customers in addition to service. Signals were loud and clear. All those who experienced this kind of telephonic conversation declared that Stubblefield had discovered a true wonder. Stubblefield patented his vibrating telephone in 1888 and used the revenues to continue his research. Stubblefield continued his research, but he did not apply for many of the patents that he should have, as he felt the need to perfect his inventions first. He did, however, hold several public demonstrations of music and voice transmission. The first and most notable was on New Year's Day of 1902 in Murray, Kentucky, and it was witnessed by a reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Their article says that Stubblefield placed his transmitter in the courthouse square and ran 2 wires from it into the ground. He established 5 listening stations at various parts of the town, as much as 6 blocks away. Then his son Bernard took his place at the transmitter. The article goes on to say he talked, whispered, whistled, and played a harmonica. Simultaneously, everyone at the receivers heard him with remarkable distinctness. At that moment, Stubblefield became a prophet with honor in his country. This was in 1902, but Stubblefield had actually been holding private demonstrations in Murray, Kentucky for more than 10 years prior to this point. With public recognition, he went on to hold several public demonstrations in 1902. One of the most notable was a ship-to-shore transmission from the steamship Bartholdi on the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. He also held a notable demonstration in Fairmount Park in Philadelphia and tried to hold one in New York's Central Park. All of the demonstrations were successful except the one in Central Park, where Stubblefield said he could not find suitable ground conducive to the experiment. But what made all of this possible? With no wires connecting them and only metal rods put into the ground at random places, how was communication possible? The secret seems to be hidden in a mysterious black box that some have called an earth battery. An article by Harvey Geller in a 1977 edition of High Fidelity magazine, tried to explain what it was. And I quote from that. What was Stubblefield's secret? By speaking into a device similar to a telephone transmitter, Stubblefield discovered that a current carrying his voice varied in accordance with the vibrations of the transmitter's diaphragm. He also found that in order to transmit his voice without wires, he had to provide a radio frequency. Its source seems to have been his earth battery and his crazy box. To vary the amplitude of the current, he required a modulator, apparently in that box. His receiving apparatus, in principle, consisted of two basic parts of a modern unit: a device sensitive to the transmission and a detector whose function was to translate radio frequency waves into the low-frequency vibrations of speech. By tapping the receiving coils at different intervals, he provided a means for adjusting the inductance. He didn't perfect fine-tuning, and his detector cannot be found, but he seems to have grasped the fundamental principles of radio. With public recognition, investors called on Stubblefield. He got involved with a group calling themselves the Wireless Telephone Company of America, a group whose only investment was the paper that their stock certificates were printed on, as you see. Stubblefield claimed that the company then swindled him out of all of his stock. He wrote a letter to an official of the company claiming that the company had been practicing fraud or deception. He said, "There remains nothing for me to do but go home." In addition, he claimed that many of his inventions had been stolen from a trunk in Philadelphia. Many of the papers in that trunk later showed up in the possession of the Collins Radio Corporation of Canada and were incorporated into their patents. They later marketed their products in the U.S. by striking a deal with the aforementioned Wireless Telephone Company of America. Ironically, Stubblefield got a U.S. and a Canadian patent on his designs in 1908, but it was too late, as similar products had been patented previously. When Stubblefield returned to Murray, Kentucky, he continued experimenting and at one point tried to create a school. He called it Telephone Del Green, the Nathan Stubblefield Industrial School and Experiments in Wireless Telephony. It was a failure, and he eventually lost his farmhouse to creditors. He spent his later years in a shack that was constructed with his own hands, suspicious of most everyone, and rejecting the efforts of neighbors to help him. On March 30th, 1928, his body was found in his shack as he had died from starvation. What conclusion can we reach from the story of Stubblefield? What we know is that he transmitted signals through energy that was found in the ground, while Marconi and others used radio waves which traveled through the air. One of the best explanations I've found is from an article by Aldrich Daimler. He says, "Many would argue that Nathan B. Stubblefield's invention in 1885 of wireless telephony was the real advent of radio, and rightfully so. Academicians of the radio elite would offer that there is a significant difference between that of underground telephony and underground radio. The signals used in underground telephony are said to travel through the earth, while in underground radio, a portion of the signal reaches the surface of the earth and is propagated in a more Hertzian fashion. While this may be partly true, the method of propagation is essentially the same. The difference lies with the frequency used. Underground telephony utilizes audio signals, frequencies which are considered to be in the VLF, or very low frequency range. Radio telephony uses RF, radio frequency, and these are frequencies which are categorized as considerably higher than that of acoustic signals. So Nathan Stubblefield did invent radio, but VLF radio. Stubblefield's underground telephony VLF system was very simple. Two metal rods were used for each telephone set and were inserted into the ground several feet apart. Each set was outfitted with a large horn to act as a loudspeaker. A small carbon button microphone transmitted the voice messages through the Earth to the other receiving set. The most interesting thing about the device was that it was powered only by the natural currents of the Earth, derived solely from his patented Earth battery. Stubblefield later suggested that he was developing a more powerful apparatus using automatic relays in which distance would be unlimited, because he never transmitted for a greater distance than 1 mile. And for some reasons that are unknown, Stubblefield would later abandon Earth telephony in favor of experiments with wireless through the air. Either Stubblefield became disenchanted with the performance of his ground VLF system, or he simply left the idea to the many patent infringers to figure out. It is probable that that latter reason, the patent infringers, combined with the Central Park failure, caused Stubblefield to abandon any further explorations, with his underground telephony system. So where does this leave us? In the present day, Murray State University lies in the area of Nathan Stubblefield's long-defunct farm and farmhouse. A monument there says the following: "Here in 1902, Nathan B. Stubblefield, inventor of radio, broadcast and received the human voice by wireless. He made experiments 10 years earlier. His home was 100 feet west of here." In addition, at 1340 on the AM dial in Murray, there is a station called WNBS, the initials of Stubblefield in their call letters. Their station ID used to say, I don't know if it still does, "You are tuned to WNBS, 1340 on your radio dial in Murray, Kentucky, the birthplace of broadcasting." In the sense of what broadcasting was to become, Stubblefield probably did not invent radio. There is no doubt, however, that he was a brilliant innovator whose mind could have been used to great advantage by those who developed the radio industry. Instead, his misfortune, paranoia, and bad business sense led to him just being an interesting footnote in radio history.